Hello, listeners, and welcome to Driving the Future in association with Barclays and Big Commerce, discovering what the future of online automotive looks like for the industry. Today's episode is focused on the next generation and how young people view car ownership. And I'm super excited to introduce you to our guest speaker today from across the pond, Steph Strickland, and her role at JUV. Hey, Steph, how's it going?
Hello, hello. It's going so great. I'm so happy to be here.
Fantastic. Now, my notes say that you're the Senior Director of Research for the Gen Z
Yeah.
Culture Expert and Social Science Researcher. So what does that entail? What does that mean?
It means that I spend all day, every day talking to young people, understanding how media impacts young people and how the world is going to be shifted in a commercial and cultural way by young people and how they interact with media and the digital world and all of the crazy things that are happening right now.
That's super interesting. It's obviously on topic as well because it's constantly evolving, constantly learning. So yeah, I think our listeners will be really excited to see what's happening with the Gen Z culture. So it'd be great, first of all, obviously, to find out a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how you joined JUV, and also what JUV does.
Yeah, so JUV is a purpose driven marketing agency. We're based out of New York City and LA. And basically, our job is, and why we were founded, was to bring young people to the table because we realized that a lot of the world was talking about Gen Z or Gen Z, however you prefer to call them. And no one was really talking to us. Everyone had a lot to say and a lot of guesses about how we wanted to interact with the world, but weren't bringing us to the table to have those sort of conversations. And so the idea of JUV was to bring diverse young people into the room and start having those conversations. And so now we get to work with Fortune 500 brands and companies that are looking to connect better with young people and make predictions about the future of the economy and the types of commercial ventures that young people will be taking. And it's a lot of fun to be able to take stabs at guessing what the future might hold for young people, especially with a generation that has made such large shifts in culture and in this sort of area of defiance, in this area of taking a stand for something and growing on the predecessors that came before us, like millennials and the stances that they took. So it's really cool and inspiring to be able to work with young people every day and be able to tell their stories and bring them to the table and hear them out.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, giving people a voice is what people have fought for years, and I think
Yeah.
obviously understanding that, and with so much money spent in advertising, marketing, and kind of creating products or software, it's we talk about customer centricity, and sometimes we actually forget the customer. And obviously, it sounds like Juve, not JUV, is doing that and bringing it to the table. So that's really interesting. I'm looking forward to kind of deep diving a little bit because I know you've done some research for us already, and we can go through some of those components. So, how about yourself? How did you come to joining Juve, and what's your background?
Yeah, so I actually started my career as a journalist. And so I got a degree from the University of Florida in journalism and worked a little bit with TV radio things. So kind of feel like I'm called back to that time being here today. And went on to get my master's degree from University of Florida in market research. And during that time there, Juve and I were connected and they were like, do you want to do research for us? Do you want to lead our research? Do you kind of want to head up this department that we're investing more into? And I, being very young and wide eyed, was like, yeah, of course I'll do that. And so essentially, my role every day is to kind of translate the language of Gen Z into something that people can understand and utilize in a very actionable sort of way. And so I also, outside of Juve, do a lot of work within the climate space specifically. So I'm really pumped to talk about the ways that the climate change and climate impacts will have an effect on how young people buy cars and car purchases in particular. And I also am a social scientist, so I do a lot of studies. I spend every day in spreadsheets and every day in focus groups or surveys and interview settings. And I just really love learning about people, and I find that to be a very unique way to tell stories is by sitting with people and truly understanding where they're coming from and finding a way to communicate that to others. So
Awesome,
that's me. I'm also a
fantastic.
proud Cooper owner, by the way.
Yeah, we did a bit of a pre warm up to this, and you were kind of you've got a bit of a tell us a bit about your story about Mini Coopers. It's quite an interesting one.
I kind of stumbled into a Mini Cooper, and it makes me look like a total car aficionado when I'm out on the road. And so when I was 16, and my parents needed some help carting my siblings and I around, and we needed the sort of practicality that a car brings for a young person, but didn't want all of the space, and they didn't want me to be carting other high schoolers around at the time. So we kind of co-invested in a very small, very old two-door Mini Cooper base model. And then, time passed and that car faded out. And I, now within the last year had the opportunity to make my first real big car purchase on my own. And I gravitated right back to the Mini Cooper. It just handles so well. It does everything that I needed to do. I have a very active lifestyle. I'm a big hiker, big climber. And I often I have gotten like little things on my windshield where people were like, flash your lights at other minis, join the mini club of this city that you're in right now. And so there is like a weird sense of community similar to the Jeep community that the Mini
Oh,
Cooper has that I certainly enjoy being a part of.
fantastic. That's great. And you actually touched on something as you were kind of telling that story, and it was a big purchase for you. And
Yeah.
if you think about car ownership, after a house or a flat, car ownership can be like the second biggest purchase in your life. And obviously with
Yeah.
Gen Z as well, not across all generations, it's a big chunk of money. So it'd be good to understand how this demographic industry kind of works in the industry of automotive, and why car ownership is so important for the Gen Z culture.
Car ownership is important because there are always going to be needs for cars, especially in the United States. The infrastructure is such that we'll always have a need. But we are noticing that Gen Z is buying cars at a much lower rate than previous generations, or at least we're later to do so. There was a study in the United States that found that for nearly half of people in the 16 to 18 age range had a driver's license when they were at that teenage years. But now Gen Z is closer to 25% having a driver's license around that time, and that was as of 2020. And so we know that Gen Z is using cars less frequently and are buying cars less frequently. And I kind of want to dispel a little bit of a myth, though, in saying that, such that millennials were a little bit the same way. They were slower to make that big purchase, right? And I think a lot of this comes back to who has the purchasing power. And Gen Z does not have the purchasing power right now. That will change within the next 5 to 10 years. And so I don't think that there are alarm bells that need to be going off in the automotive industry such that, Gen Z is anti-car or anti making these sorts of big purchases. But I think a little bit of contextualization around the state of the economy, the world of student loans, the slow progression of accumulating wealth for young people, like, needs to be taken into consideration when we're talking about these huge purchases. And buying my first car was a really big deal, and I had to do a lot of financial planning in order to get there. And I felt like I was ahead of the game in doing so. And I know a lot of young people that are much, much later to that game. And there are a lot of more affordable alternatives to buying a car. And so Gen Z, I think, while cars are still important to them and are important to the lifestyles that we have, especially in the US, which is very car centric as a culture, I do think that Gen Z will be slower to get onto the train of buying, these big purchases, such as a car, simply because of the cost barrier and the accessibility of alternatives.
Makes total sense. I think the other thing as well is to kind of just to touch on some of those points is that in the past 5 years, the enablement of social kind of car sharing, from
Yeah.
buying, being able to like use Uber as a much more accessible way rather than having to use taxis and cabs. In the UK, in large cities now, we have electric scooters, so it's not like you have to get from A to B and do that. There's online service platforms where you can hire a car for the day if you need to shift some luggage or do whatever. So I think the actual buying model of around transportation has changed very differently. Has changed quite significantly in the past 5 years, and obviously that has an impact on buying cars, but it also has an impact on how we use the cars as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you were putting yourself in a young person's shoes living in a city, why would you buy a car? Like, you have all of these, like, all of the options that you just mentioned, and your alternative to doing that is paying $300-400 a month in US to pay on a car payment. I paid $300 a month just to park that car, and then you have to pay for repairs and gas on top. It's just not worth it when you have so many alternatives. And that's something that I think is the difference between a lot of previous generations and Gen Z, where like young people have always had this sort of like phases of growing up. Buying your first car and having your first car is kind of this like pivotal moment of growing up and becoming an adult. But there are differences in growing up in the 90s versus growing up now. And now there are so many different alternatives to that sort of life stage. And the cultural sort of impact of having your first car and having that be kind of the stepping stone into adulthood just isn't hitting as hard with Gen Z. We don't care about that sort of traditional life path because our traditional life paths have already been entirely disrupted and interrupted by things like COVID and economies and all of these things that we've been dealing with from a very young age. And while every generation has those sorts of things, I think it's uniquely hitting the car industry and a few other industries in particular.
I think that's really important because obviously there's a kind of a few components to owning or using a car, and one of them is the kind of the functionality and practicality of it. But
Yep.
what we see more and more through Gen Z is a consideration around sustainability and the eco-friendliness
Yeah.
utilizing the car. Can you kind of explore a little bit more about what's happening there as well?
Yeah, let's get into that because I think that's going to be a really important thing for the car industry to keep an eye on. In a study that we did at JUV, 65% of our respondents said that eco-friendliness in a car was important to them. And other studies are popping up that are showing similar metrics where a strong, strong majority of young people are looking for electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, or just the option to be a little bit more eco-friendly in their car purchase. And I just think that metric is so mind-blowing as such a strong majority agreeing on this one thing as being important, right? And I think I try to think about why this might be the case. Like, why do people care about eco-friendliness in a car in particular? Frankly, it's a higher rate than we see in like food purchases or clothing purchases. People are considering eco-friendliness in cars more often than they are in other spaces. And I was thinking to myself why that might be the case. And I speculate that it might be because young people are inundated with all of the little things that we could be doing to make a difference in the climate crisis, and all of the big ways that the climate crisis is impacting our lives, but feeling like we're just kind of slowly chipping away at that iceberg, right? We can barely make a difference one small action at a time. Buying an eco-friendly car kind of feels like a big way to make a difference, one thing that makes a big difference. And so I think for that reason, that sort of car purchase and making a more sustainable purchase in this industry in particular gives young people and gives all people a very tangible way to make a much larger difference in that particular area of impact.
It's quite interesting that because we're going to move on to a question around kind of what the impact of societal shifts play in influencing young people when they're
Mm-hmm.
buying their cars. And, probably about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, the Prius was a massive thing in LA. Everyone was, you had to be seen in a Prius because it was eco-friendly, it was EV, it was hybrid, etc. Now we have the kind of the models through Tesla, and it's how do I say this in a kind of a polite way? It's cool to be seen in a Tesla, and you're also making a mark on the economy, and you're a kind of on the kind of the social aspect of things. It kind of ticks
Mm-hmm.
a lot of boxes. But what have you seen in terms of how that's being influenced through kind of Gen Z buyers in that kind of sector at the moment?
Yeah, I think obviously being able to hit a few birds with one stone is a really appealing thing, right? But I do think in our first car purchase, the sort of cool factor of your car drops down a little bit less important. Things like price parity, things like eco friendliness, those are going to rise to the surface when we're talking about the immediate current to the next 5 year car purchases for young people. But I think as we go out beyond that, we already have started seeing in our surveying that people have their eyes on a Tesla. They have their eyes on, the electric version of very nice cars that also have that cool factor and also kind of have that social currency of, being able to be part of the car community, being a car person, being somebody who knows about this and invests in this and cares about this. And Gen Z is very community driven, such that there's like this in and out sort of mentality. We want to fit into a lot of different niches and a lot of different communities. And so you talk about the Prius as like you either had it or you didn't, and you were in or you were out. And Gen Z is a lot like that. There's just more communities to choose from. And so I think, buying a Tesla maybe for some people gets them in with the tech bro community, but also gets them in with the eco-friendly community, the crunchy granola
Yeah.
community, there's a lot of different ways to fit in when you have a car that speaks to a lot of different areas. And so I think it's also on car manufacturers to recognize the sort of a community appeal that their cars have, and invest in that, invest in those communities.
So I think that's really interesting because you touched on the community aspect, but when we were
Yeah.
chatting before, you also touched on and a big part, and you said it. You said it as part of your introduction around your Mini Cooper. It was lifestyle. You could chuck stuff in the boot. It pretty much got you everywhere. It was reliable. Do you want to kind of just elaborate a little bit more in terms of the kind of the lifestyle aspect around those kind of community components?
Yeah, there's something about, the products that we buy being a sort of calling card to who we are. And I think this kind of flows into what we wanted to talk about next, which was like how do societal shifts play into young people's views on cars, and like how that has changed. And I think a lot of the ways that cars were represented in media over the last 50 years have been focused on the ideal lifestyle. An archetype is created and then presented to the world and said, you want to be part of this archetype. This is the ideal version of you, if you see yourself in this in some capacity. But now I think it's about relatability. And a lot of people are developing their identities in very niche ways, kind of independent of the archetypes created by the media, and then look to that media to affirm that. And so now it's about being relatable. It's about fitting into those communities. It's about fostering the connections between drivers and encouraging people like the Mini Cooper owners to put little tags on each other's windshield and say, hey, cool car, join our club if you want to. We all talk about minis and fix our minis and talk about detailing and just cool things, right? And bring people together around that. And I think that car manufacturers, car brands that are looking to future proof are investing in those communities rather than investing in the archetypes of the ideal person that they seem to have historically presented in the media. Like this cool car guy that's single and a bachelor and like has a cool truck. That's a much different sort of archetype that has been broadcasted than like the community of people who go out rock climbing and bouldering and just have this sort of collective group that they're a part of. And what does that look like, and how can you foster that sort of practical use of your product? And so I think that that's the shift that's happening, is like the idealism versus the relatability and the realism of a use of a car.
And companies being proactive about that. So are they using digital platforms to influence those community purchasing decisions in a different way now? Are they kind of creating those scenes in different formats and telling different stories using the same product but in different nuances?
I think that sometimes, but largely no. I can't think of. I was really racking my brain for like examples of car brands that I think are really fostering community well, and there aren't a ton of examples out there, and there certainly aren't that have been as mainstream as some of the more traditional forms of advertising that we see for cars. Which is like, by the way, can we talk about how many car commercials have like big trucks driving up the side of a mountain still? And who is that
Yeah,
for? I don't
yeah,
know. It's not for me. I would venture to guess it's not for Gen Z either. I would say the majority of us probably don't even know how to parallel park. We're not driving up the side of a mountain, right? And so the image that we see on the TV in media is not how these cars are actually being used. And so I think that is the biggest opportunity area when we're talking about appealing to young people and just appealing to the way that the world is now, which is all about relatability, and culture is all about like accessibility and things like that. We've shifted to a certain extent because of social media. And so I think car brands kind of need to keep up a little bit in being able to tap into those communities. And I'll call out like one that I think is doing well. We spoke about this before, but Subaru has a very strong brand affinity with young people. And a lot of young people trace it back to they were the first and only car manufacturer to have a queer presence in the 90s in their media, right? They were the only ones to show an archetype of a person that was different than the traditional archetype that we see in car commercials. And that alone was appealing enough to Gen Z that 30 years later, that is still the callback that people are making to that brand, right? And they've done other things, like they've partnered with the AAAU, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and that's really cool. Young people love science. Young people are very tapped in, as we've talked about, to the climate crisis and to the ways that science comes into our lives. And so I think that they're doing something right, but by and large, I'm not seeing a lot of car manufacturers or brands really hopping into this community first mindset. They're stuck a little bit in the traditional forms of media.
I think there's a balance as well, because as you were talking through that, so like I've been with the adverts that have been on the television recently, you're
Yeah.
right. There's massive 4x4s going up the side of a mountain and
Mm-hmm.
then reversing very, very close to the edge and then parking up. And I don't know what lifestyle that's kind of pitching at. It's not me necessarily. But then on the flip side, in terms of how I use a car, if I take my kids to their after school clubs and hobbies, and they eat biscuits and snacks, and I chuck stuff in the boot, and it's really easy to do that. Similarly, I don't want that. That's not an aspiration that I was necessarily want someone to pitch to me that, yeah, it's really crummy in the back, but there's loads of room essentially. So I think there's a balance in terms of how you talk to people and what you're positioning. But you're right, there just seems to be a massive gap of people driving through cities at night time super fast, and wearing suits and what have you, to the reality of the mundane, as it, to some extent, yeah.
Yeah, so you're saying that like the reality and the practicality and the ways that you actually use your car would not sell you on your car in totality. There has to be a little sprinkle of idealism in there. There has to be a sprinkle
Sure.
of like the aspirational, right? Is that kind of what you feel
Oh,
as in
oh,
your
100%. Yeah, but I think that at the moment there's a bit too much of a gap in terms of the aspirational of kind of, there's, you can literally drive up Kilimanjaro in this car, and I'm like, well, I'm never going to do that. However, I might want to go to the beach with the kids and take it on the sand if there's an opportunity to do that. That's more of a kind of this aspiration, and then there's something that you're not going to achieve, and then there's a kind of a reality check where actually it resonates and it ticks a few boxes. I look at some of those adverts, and this is just from a personal position. I look at some of those adverts, and I'm like, that looks like a car that can do something, but it doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily resonate with me in terms of, I know you're a hiker and a climber. We live right next to the Peak District, and it's amazing out there, and we get snow and all sorts of things. But at no point have I necessarily gone, I need to buy that car because I know I can get through snow in those areas or whatever. So I think
Yeah.
it's tapping into the right cultural components, the right pieces, but resonating. But then to some extent, people do want to just be sold a dream as well, don't they? They kind of do want
Yeah.
to. They do want to be sold that what that dream is. Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of influencers come in though. I think that's like the role of the influencer is like
Yes.
influencers are that sort of cultural touch point to specific communities and like the practical use of that community, whether you're part of the outdoor community or you're a parent and you're following a mom blog or whatever community that you're kind of a part of, they translate this sort of aspirational idealism that comes from the brands themselves, because the brands always want to be aspirational. They want to be the best of the best, of course, and they funnel it into what is actually practical for that community. And so I think that maybe creators are kind of where we find that middle ground between like how you would buy a car and how I might buy a car.
100, you're absolutely right. And if you look at any funnel, if you look at any sales funnel, it goes from really wide to really like narrow, and then a specific purchase. An acquisition has taken place, be it services, be it product, whatever it is. And the kind of the discovery phase right at the start might be that aspirational reversing onto a cliff edge, as a 4x4. And then the maturity of that might be, oh, you know what, I'm going to go onto a car marketplace and just see what the reviews are like. And then the next component might be, oh, there might be something on Instagram or Facebook that's saying, oh, I used this car and I had a really good weekend at the weekend. So they're kind of going through this funnel, and there's multiple different touch points in terms of where the customer's been educated. And then finally there's a purchase. But it's about making sure that they can go through all of those different education points to get to that kind of endpoint. Awesome.
Yeah.
So we touched on it a little bit earlier around the kind of not necessarily just buying a car in the kind of traditional way that I would have kind of, like you said, that kind of maturity or step through kind of growing up. There's different options and different models around. So it might be subscription model, it might be ride sharing. Can you talk a little bit more about what the young people or what Gen Z are doing in that kind of instance?
Yeah, so I think ride sharing is an important thing to talk about when we're also talking about car ownership, because really we're the first generation that has access to cars to get around place to place in a relatively small geographic area, but perhaps everything that we need without having to hitchhike. And so, this is really new, I think, in a lot of ways to how it's going to impact the car buying industry. Young people are the largest users of ride sharing apps. Nearly half are using ride sharing apps between the ages of 21 to 29, right? And so we know that this is a large cohort of the people that are utilizing apps like Uber, Lyft, etc. We also know that bike sharing and scooter sharing are becoming much more popular. They really kind of got their start on college campuses. Interestingly enough, I used a moped to get around on my college campus in undergrad. That was my mode of transportation, right? And now scooters are very, very popular there and across the country, in the United States at least, on college campuses as an easy way to get around, because I don't know if it's the same around the world, but parking on a college campus, are you kidding? You're never going to get that. It's simply never going to happen. And so, these alternative forms of transportation have been developed in the absence, I think, of public transit or easily accessible public transit, that make car buying seem less appealing, or at least less appealing in the immediate future, right? And so that's what I was talking about with this sort of delayed effect of buying, where millennials had sort of the same thing, but I think Gen Z is going to see even more, where they're able to survive much, much longer of their young adult lives without needing a car because of the access to these sort of things. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought with the second part of your question. What was the second part?
No, it's okay. In terms of kind of how they're how the young people are adopting those and how they're utilizing them essentially over kind of like traditional just purchasing a car.
Yes. You also mentioned subscription services, which I think we need to talk about, because everyone wants to do a subscription service. The scooter and bike options, and I think even Uber now has different subscription models that you can have for ride sharing and for alternative forms of transportation. And so I think some car companies are looking at that and saying, can we get in on that? Is leasing and flexible ownership the path forward for young people? And to that, I would say tread lightly. For some reason, everyone has decided that the Netflix subscription model is Bible, and that it just works across all industries, and that it works across all different types of products. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that the subscription model works when there is flexibility. And I think that there's a lot of hoops to jump through to have a car and to have access to a car. In the United States, you can't even legally rent a car until you're 25. And so there's a lot of legal hoops to jump through: registration, payments, parking, tickets, all of these sort of things that could impact the flexibility of being able to just easily, I'm going to rent this, or I'm going to use this, or I'm going to have this for a short period of time, that make that perhaps a bit trickier in the car buying industry in particular, especially, like I said, when ride sharing and biking and scootering is just so easy and accessible in comparison, right? And so to the idea of trying to modernize the way people buy cars and doing so through a subscription model, I would just say tread lightly.
Awesome. So we've covered kind of where Gen Z is at the moment, the kind of path to where we are, some of the kind of the background and the statistics around what's kind of you've understood and discovered. What does the road ahead look like for Gen Z? What will their relationship with cars? I think we've touched on quite a few pieces there, but if you want to kind of just kind of recap and just summarize for us, that would be good.
Yeah, I think cars are going to become more and more of a practical purchase. And I think they're only going to be a practical purchase that comes much later than we might expect in the traditional sort of growing up process. That first car purchase, that sort of mark of adulthood, is not a badge that Gen Z is going to wear at the same time as our millennial, Gen X, and boomer predecessors. It's just not going to look the same. But that's not to say that it won't look like something that could be really exciting, especially in the world of eco car buying, electric vehicles, new technology. I think all of that is really exciting and is getting Gen Z really excited about the ways that they can make an impact and show the ways that they make an impact to the world, because we know that's important to them as the digital and social media natives that they are. And I think that the path ahead, while it looks different from other generations, is also quite a big opportunity to grow the industry itself. Thinking of new models for the ways that people buy cars, thinking about how we can make it accessible, flexible, and easy for people to do this, to remove this sort of stigma of like, I'm going to walk into a dealership and get totally swindled and grifted, right? We want to move past that, right? And that's the opportunity that Gen Z is kind of forcing car brands to step into. And so I'm really curious to see the brands that will.
Fantastic. I've thoroughly enjoyed the past 30 minutes or so. It's been incredible to find out more about Gen Z, about what JUV do, and kind of the impacts that are happening there. How can listeners find out more about yourself, Steph, or about JUV in terms of further details, please?
Definitely. So I am on LinkedIn at Steph Strickland, and you can also throw me a follow on Instagram at Steph Said It, and of course follow JUV Consulting on LinkedIn and Instagram as well, and keep up with Gen Z updates and factoids and all of the fun research that we're doing over there. We also have a newsletter called The Screenshot, which will give you a little glimpse of all of the Gen Z trends that your brand might be needing or might help contextualize some of the work that you're doing. And so I'd hope you subscribe to that. And I've really enjoyed being here. This has been so cool to get to explore this whole industry with you and give Gen Z a chance to speak on it.
No, hugely appreciate your time, and thank you for kind of contributing to the podcast and driving the future. And like Steph said, if you'd like to find out and hear more, then please log on and you can visit autofixersolutions.com. Thanks very much, Steph. Have a good rest of the day.
You too.